often reveals the truth of who we are. Lon and I had a professor that we loved so much in seminary. We've shared a story of him frequently showing up in the winter to classes without his coat on because while traveling from his apartment to the seminary, he had found someone in need of a coat, and he took his off and he gave it away. Dr. Orr was infamous for coming in without a coat or gloves sometimes or a hat, because his first response was to give him what he had. Another wonderful story about Dr. Orr's, when Lon and I had decided to get married, we knew we needed a little premarital counseling, more from the fact that I come from my father being married 3 times, and I thought, it'd be sort of good to talk about all that and the implications for marriage. And but we were a little hesitant where to turn, and it dawned on us that maybe Dr. Orr would be a great person to visit with. So on the time we asked him if he would meet with us, he said, "Come and pick me up at the apartment." We stopped in front of his house, and he slowly came down the steps, an older gentleman. He hopped into the back seat of the car, leaned over and said, "Mildred never lets us have pancakes. We're going out to eat." And to pancakes we went, and Lon and I kind of looked at each other thinking, what have we gotten ourselves into? And yet, suddenly the thought of premarital counseling was completely changed into a conversation over pancakes with a wonderful man who began to share the stories of the impact Mildred had had on his life and what it meant to be married to her. Frequently, what we do and what we say reveals a lot about who we are. I have often been attracted to watching things that Benedict Cumberbatch is in, even though I always have to think about his name when I'm getting ready to say it. On PBS, he had the Sherlock series, and recently he was one of the central stars in The Imitation Game, which is really an awesome movie. Having portrayed a mathematician in The Imitation Game, a group of folks trying to figure out the enigma, which was the manner in which Germany was sending out their messages, and Britain and the world was trying to discern what the enigma code was. And the gentleman that he portrays in this movie was one of the team working on this. Hopefully not to ruin anything for you if you haven't seen it, a subline is that he also happened to be a gay man, this scientist and mathematician. And having played this part, Benedict has now been petitioning the government to release the names of 49,000 men who had been arrested for being gay during the period of time in which this mathematician found himself being gay, asking that their names be removed because it's now a defunct old law, and it now is one that just does not make sense that you might be arrested for being gay. He has taken this and pursued having those names released from papers that still are there to say they had been arrested because of the gender of sexuality that they had discovered themselves to be. What we do and what we say says an awful lot about who we are. Jesus, we ask that question about him. We wonder sometimes, who is this Jesus? And isn't it wonderful that we have a book that we can go to that tells story upon story about someone backing up with their words and their actions who and what they say they are. Who is this Jesus? We ask that this morning, and maybe we ask it on a regular basis in our lives. Who is this Jesus? And maybe even we would ask, what does he have to do with us today? Jesus in our story, Mark's telling of this Jesus is so interesting in relationship to how the other Gospels begin the first moments of Jesus' public ministry. In Luke, we have a great story of Jesus going to a mountain and telling a sermon. Clearly, this is a teacher and a preacher who's astonishing. We find him doing something different. In Luke, he goes to his hometown, presents a homily, which everybody is thoroughly captured in for a while, until they think about throwing him off a cliff because they've discovered the truth of what he's speaking of. We also have in John Jesus' first miracle. He's at a wedding in Cana of Galilee with his mother. There isn't enough wine. He turns water into wine. Wow, what a great, nice story. These three stories, all giving a picture of Jesus, each gospel writer trying to suggest something about who he was. Abundance, a teacher, one who could preach. And Mark, he comes in as usual, gangbusters, no holds barred. Jesus walks into the synagogue and bam, and shazam, that word again. There's a confrontation and there's conversation about who he is and about what his authority is. So first of all, he's coming into a situation where there are scribes discussing and talking about the scriptures for the day. They're doing the good and right work that scribes would do, reflecting, praying, sharing, dialoguing, realizing they don't have the authority to tell the definitive word, but the great rabbis of the past and Moses and the laws, now they could tell us. I think the scribes get a bad rap frequently. They were doing the job they felt called to, and they were doing a good job. They just didn't know that there was something more that could be brought to these scriptures, and that was a definitive word. And Jesus comes in speaking, relating to the scribes, and suddenly everyone's astounded because he's doing something that hadn't been done before. He gives definitive, declarative news about a word from God for today and about the law of Moses, which is verging right from the start on blasphemy, because maybe the scribes felt no one but God could tell what God's word was. But they're astounded by that. They're unnerved a bit by it. Who is this Jesus? So the first point, Jesus coming in with great authority into situations, coming in, sort of breaking bounds and boundaries again, as we saw even with his very baptism. Remember, the heavens are torn open, torn apart. God comes in and says, this is my beloved. And so this is the very heavens torn Jesus that's coming into the synagogue on that day, and he comes in with the authority of God. He comes in with an important word. Been reading about a story that's coming out of South Africa, and particularly its words on the lips of Desmond Tutu. This week, there's a man who's being released, who was one of the guards who killed at least 100 people that were protesting anti-apartheid movement 20 years ago. And in the midst of the truth and reconciliation work that Desmond Tutu did 20-some years ago, he was given an opportunity and took the opportunity to talk to 100 families of whom he had murdered their children. Beginning a conversation that's been happening in South Africa for now the 20 years, where people have been brought together to try to reconcile, to come to grips with what has happened, and to offer words of forgiveness to people that do awful things. Well, the group has decided that after 20 years of still serving in a prison, because there were 6 murders that they were unable to tie to specific instances and to specific families, they've now decided to release this man that had been given 2 life sentences. Feeling like it's time to move on, says Desmond Tutu. It's time to forgive. And what might it say of our nation and our people if we were to make this move? I'm not sure how I feel or how you feel about this. Words from South Africa about having had years past, and it's time, if a person continues to make the right steps, of which he has continued to write letters to ask for forgiveness. But what does this mean? This is an interesting word to us, a breaking of bounds that I assume won't be broken. What does it mean to hear these words from Desmond Tutu about forgiveness? Intrusive. Jesus' word is often intrusive in our world. It's not something we expect to hear or expect to see. Jesus brings words frequently that break into our lives and our realm because it's God coming. So he came and he spoke with authority. The other thing that happens to Jesus that's followed closely by this is this unclean man in a holy place. What is this? Synagogues are holy places. Unclean men were not welcome, especially if they convulsed, if they had seizures. Something's going on with this man that claims him to be demon-possessed, but I love this in Scripture. I love that Mark says, and there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. There's a separation. There's a man who has an unclean spirit within him, but this does not define him as not still being a man. There's great work being done to say, you know, there's disease and there's addiction. There are things going on in the lives of people, but it doesn't define ultimately who they are. They are still human beings. They are still men and women and children. And I love the fact that Mark uses that language here to separate. Really a caged man, a man caged and held by a spirit, comes in to see Jesus, and I'm not sure what attracted him there that day, and we don't know the outcome of this story, what happened to him, apart from the word that it went out from there throughout the surrounding region, that Jesus had done an amazing thing. Quickly, shortly, short encounter. And what I see here is Jesus immediately in Mark taking on the powers that feel so oppressive and so beyond us to control. Do I have any control? That's the question. The things that are so powerful and take a hold of us. Have you ever felt like a workaholic? If you've felt a little cornered by that, raise your hands and join me today. Has the schedule ever ruled your life? Have you ever felt possessed by illness or by anger or by grief? Has anything ever possessed you? You know, sometimes we say that, I just don't know what possessed me to buy that jacket the other day. But I saw it and I just had to have it. You know, that moment of kind of being possessed. We use it, but this I understand is something a little deeper, but nonetheless we have senses of what it means to feel like we've been taken over by something. Anger's a good one, isn't it? At stoplights, in checkout lines, you're tapping your toe and man, you would just really like to bulldoze through. Here is someone unable to escape whatever has a hold of him. It's a power too strong, too forceful, and Jesus comes in to say, nothing is too small for me. I have three words, silence and come out. And the man is freed on the moment. Short confrontation. No chance. Suddenly the influence is gone from his life. Now I'm not going to belittle the fact that with many addictions and troubles in our world, there's a lot of work that goes into being released from the cage. But nonetheless, what we have brought to us today is a word from Jesus that indeed we are beloved and we are forgiven and there are tools to be set free and we're not bad people when we're stuck in things. We just have some wrong actions because we're vulnerable and we're broken and we know what it means to experience shame, but we also can learn what it means to develop shame resilience. And it takes community and it takes support and it takes the work of God's Spirit in prayer. So my young friend, I've mentioned a friend who's 2 years sober. We'll say it's been terrible work, but each step of learning resilience, of learning that she's loved and that she's not bad for having been so caught up in synthetic drugs, and that there's a community to support her, and therefore she's now able to share her story. It's called empathy and compassion that comes out of it. Something more, something big. And I think that's what the man ran around the region telling people. Do you know, I met someone that had compassion and empathy for me and said a couple of words to me and suddenly I was released and there was hope and there was something new about my life. Authority and a word spoken and someone is set free. I think I need to hear these words. I think we all do. From the fear and the anger and the workaholic tendencies and the illness and the affluenza and the addiction. Sorry, I'm throwing the Super Bowl in. I can't help it. I'm going to be watching it. Don't get me wrong. But I also know about the domestic violence that will take care and the trafficking of women that's happened all weekend because of the Super Bowl. There are things about it that really are quite tragic. And do we stop for a moment to consider that? So the signs of Deuteronomy that Sherry read this morning, you'll know the prophet because the words that they speak will come true and will happen, and you'll see them. Jesus gave the signs of that here in Mark. Even the demons in Mark happen to be, brothers and sisters, the only ones who know to name Jesus. You don't find it on the words of the mouths of the disciples. As you read Mark, who knows who Jesus is? The demons, those possessed. Those spirits know this man. What have you to do with us when we encounter you, Jesus? It's trouble for us and hope for the person that we're containing. In the King's Speech, that movie a few years ago, there's a great picture of what it means for one man to work with another man. King George VI, unable to speak, full of shame because of it. He couldn't stand before people and share a word. He was caught up. And so his wife Elizabeth helped find someone who would assist him in speech therapy. And slowly, even through cursing at him, through having him sing and do calisthenics and all sorts of things, slowly he was unwound and able with new hope to be able to say an important word. Hitler was a smooth talker and an able talker. King George was able to go and to preach, to speak in a manner which encouraged people to step up at that moment. A word well given. And again, it was because of someone being liberated. So Jesus, the intrusive one, the liberator, the one who articulates the words that need to be said, the one who promises when we open our hearts and lives to have this kind of very work done, not only in us, but in our community and beyond. And the good news as we go through Mark is Mark's just getting started on the stories and the pictures of who this Jesus is as we raise the question this year. Who is he? What does he have to say to us? What do we want to respond to? What do we want to embrace? He intrudes, he liberates, he articulates, and so there is joy. Joy for you and me. We're not left alone. God has stepped into our world. God reigns, and that coming of that reign means that we have hope and help for our lives that feel out of control sometimes. And again, when are we ever really in control? We're forgiven. And we come to a table today that reminds us that we're forgiven. Jesus giving his very life that you and I might know of hope and help and forgiveness, of God saying, the slate is clean and your name is beloved. Look forward to hearing more stories about who this Jesus is and walking with Mark this year. And let's remember he is able to heal the brokenhearted, to set the captive free, to raise the dead to life again, and to calm the troubled sea. Let's take a moment to pray. Gracious Lord, to you we turn. Where else have we to go? We do know about our own kinds and worlds of possession, and we wonder, is this what's going to be the meaning and the purpose of our lives? Have we hope for meaningful lives? And then you come with a word of setting a man free and of speaking with authority, and our hearts are encouraged, and we have hope. We have joy because there is help.